Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for what this is our second meeting of our Monopolies and Politics workshop series. For those who don't know, this is a workshop series that arose from our annual Stigler conference on antitrust that this year is discussing monopolies and politics. The conference was due to happen now early May, but we had to postpone, of course, because of the COVID crisis. It's going to happen now on September 10 and 11, hopefully. And then we try to enjoy the opportunity to bring together some of our conference speakers to dig more in depth on some of the, I think, are some of the very interesting topics we're going to cover in the conference. We had 2 weeks ago, Sanjing Park, a professor from Seoul National University, talking about South Korean chaebols and the connection between industrial policy and the capture of democracy. We have today Daniel and Liza talking about Nazism and the rise of Hitler. In 2 weeks, we're going to have Professor Ishai Yaffe talking about Imperial Japan. And by the end of the month, we're going to have Steve Haber and Richard John talking about the US. And for those who may be following, you also have in the Stigler Center a political economy of the COVID-19 series, which is also quite interesting. It's addressing the COVID-19 and what's going on. And then we had Professor Angus Deaton talking about healthcare. Just 2 days ago, we had Julia Kajian and Andrea Pratt talking about democracy and then the money in democracy. Next week, we have a very interesting presentation about the healthcare system and reforms of the healthcare system. So stay tuned. I'd say follow us on check or Twitter and go to our website, check our Stigler lectures to stay tuned. And well, today, I think we have a very interesting webinar. I think it's going to lead to very interesting discussions. I have the privilege of moderating this conversation between Daniel Crane, who is the Frederick Paul Furth Sr. Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School, and Liza Gormsen, who is our Senior Research Fellow and the Director of the Competition Law Forum at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law, BIICL. And she's also on the Academic Advisory Board of Open Market. Sorry. And without further ado, the way this is going to happen is we're going to have two small presentations. Daniel is going to start talking a little bit more about Germany, and Liz is going to follow with talking a bit more about the liberalism and the reform processes. Then we're going to go for a discussion and Q&A, and then you can feel free to ask questions whenever you want. And so, Daniel, I'm putting a presentation up. Can you see it well?
I can see it very well. Thank you very much, Filippo, and thank you to the Stigler Center for inviting me to participate today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion with Filippo and Liza, and also all of the comments from all of you who are participating today. So I have a few slides here just to sort of frame my own research on this topic. And if we could go to the second slide, please. The research questions that I'm looking at right now are set out in a paper that I have coming out in a day now in the Michigan Law Review called Fascism and Monopoly. And two of the questions that I'm interested in are, first of all, whether extreme concentration of economic power in Weimar Germany facilitated the rise of Nazism, and if so, by what mechanisms? And I think it's really important at the outset to understand that the question that I'm asking is different, it's significantly different from a similar sounding question that's been debated by historians and economists and political theorists ever since the end of the Second World War. And that is the question of whether German big business supported the rise of Nazism, whether in some sense corporate capitalism and corporate monopoly is a root cause of Nazism. And the way that conversation tended to go is to sort of between Marxist and anti-Marxist historians was to focus on sort of the conscious participation by big business in the rise of Germany in the lead-up period to Hitler's rise to power. And as to that question, my own reading of the literature is that the anti-Marxist historians have the better case. I have on the screen here a book by Henry Turner, a Yale historian, German Big Business, The Rise of Hitler, which I think fairly convincingly shows that pre-1933, although there was some support for Hitler among big business, most of the big monopolies and cartels were not in favor of Hitler's rise to power. They weren't giving him campaign contributions or other material support. So, and I'll talk more about this as we go forward, but my claim is not that somehow German big business intentionally brought Hitler to power. In many cases, they didn't. In fact, one of the things Turner shows in his book is that much of the support for Hitler from the business community came from small and mid-sized business people who felt excluded from the economy by the cartels and the monopolies, and they thought Hitler was going to change that for them. It turned out not to be that way at all. So I don't begin this research project intending to make any kind of a root cause or culpability claim with respect to German big business and the rise of Nazism, but instead I'm focusing on structure, which is to say whether or not the captains of industry intentionally brought Hitler to power. Was the extremely concentrated structure of the Weimar economy a contributing factor to the rise of the Third Reich? So, and that is the claim that I'm making, which is I think that there's significant evidence that in fact is the case, that whether or not big business meant this to happen this way, that the highly concentrated structure of the German economy contributed, made it easier, or facilitated Hitler's rise to power. And then, of course, the question is what mechanisms. Without knowing sort of the mechanisms, it's easy to mistake causation and correlation. So I know we'll be interested in talking in the Q&A as well about sort of understanding the mechanisms by which extreme concentration of economic power can facilitate extreme concentrations of political power. Okay, next slide, please.
Did it work?
Yep, thank you. So in terms of sources of evidence that I'm looking at, I'm focusing particularly on some archival material from the U.S. Office of Military Government, the decartelization branch. I also have a separate paper I'm working on in conjunction with the Tobin Project initiative on monopoly and democracy that gets sort of deeper into the work of that very interesting branch. This is a group of American antitrust lawyers, over 100 of them, that went to Germany in the Reconstruction period in 1945 and sort of produced a lot of archival evidence and reports about the role of German monopolies and cartels in the Third Reich and its rise to power. There have been along the way historians questioning the objectivity of some of that work, questioning their competence to really understand German history and the German economy. And so I'm certainly not relying solely on those archival materials. I'm digging pretty deeply into a number of business histories of leading German firms. In my paper, if you read, you'll see I do case studies on a number of industries and also in more general economic and political histories. So next slide, please. So this is mostly for fun. This is a picture from the Bentley Historical Library's archival materials showing the decartelization branch meeting in Berlin in 1946. They did a lot of work. They produced lots of reports. Ultimately, they were shuttered in 1949 by generals in the U.S. Army and business people who were seconded to Germany who thought that antitrust was getting in the way of the rebuilding of the German economy, and particularly did not like the idea of dismantling the German war machine entirely because it might be needed to fight Stalin. So next slide, please. All right, so in terms of evidence supporting this claim that extreme concentration of economic power supports extreme concentration of political power, one thing that I think is not in dispute or should not be in dispute is that the German economy from the mid to late 19th century up to the Weimar period undergoes a dramatic increase in industrial concentration. This graph here just shows the number of cartel agreements. Sort of at the time of Bismarck, you had very, very few, but from Bismarck forward, cartelization just becomes rampant in the German economy and just rises year by year up to the point that by the Weimar period, you have thousands of cartels running key aspects of the German economy. Next slide, please. It's also important to understand that these cartels and monopolies and the mergers that produced industrial concentration were legal. In fact, they were in some sense almost required by law. Certainly the Nazis, as we'll see, required them by law. But there were German decisions right around the time that the American courts in the early years of the Sherman Act were rejecting the argument that ruinous competition brought about by the Second Industrial Revolution and large fixed cost structures made it necessary to join cartels. Right at the time that the American courts were rejecting those arguments, German courts were holding that those were lawful reasons to be in a cartel, ruinous competition, and indeed that there might be an imperative, a responsibility on firm managers to join cartels in order to solve the problem of ruinous competition. There were no meaningful constraints on mergers or monopolies. This is one of the case studies I give in the paper concerns IG Farben, but I think it's a fairly representative example of how the chemical sector goes from a fairly competitive oligopoly structure to complete monopolization. So pre-1904, you had a fairly competitive oligopoly with 9 or 10 major firms at least in the market and many smaller ones as well. In 1904, 9 of those firms joined, 3 and 6 joined 2 cartels. And from then on out, the German chemical industry is governed either by a tight cartel agreement or by integration to a single firm. In 1925, the 2 cartels basically merge, not just the cartel structure, they actually merge into a single firm, and IG Farben is created. So now the whole German chemical industry is basically subject to one dominant firm. In the 1930s, I'll talk a bit more about this in a minute, Farben enters into a series of international market division agreements, most importantly with Standard Oil. That it was really important to the war effort eventually. By the early 1930s, as you can see from the statistics here, it was dominant in many, many sectors, if not a complete monopoly, dominant in key chemical sectors. After Hitler's rise to power, Farben becomes very quickly sort of organizationally intertwined with the military, with the regime. And from 1938 forward, as sort of Anschluss and then conquests of Europe roll out, IG Farben is actually sort of an economic arm of the regime. It's hard to find the lines between the party and the state and the firm. It serves the purpose of appropriating industry. So when the German army rolls into Poland or France, along will come Farben and sort of gobble up the chemical industries and sort of just make them part of the firm and therefore part of the regime. And of course, ultimately, it tragically participates in the atrocities at Auschwitz. So this gives you a sense of the way in a particular industry, this period is one in which you get extreme increases in concentration. Okay, next slide, please. So this is my last slide, and it just sort of previews for you my effort to get at the question of mechanism. So it's very, very clear, I think, from the historical record that from the early 20th century up through the Weimar period, that the German economy goes through a wave of dramatically increasing concentration. But the question is, to what extent does that increase in concentration make it easier for Hitler to get the kind of plenary political control that he gets? And in my paper, this is an imperfect effort, but I've sort of tried to think about ways of categorizing different mechanisms that the historical evidence suggests took shape during this period. The first one is what I describe as a Faustian bargain between big business and the monopolies in particular and Hitler. So as I said before, prior to Hitler becoming chancellor in early 1933, most of these companies were very, very skeptical of Nazism. They were very skeptical of Hitler. I mean, the word socialism still appeared in the Nazi name. That never actually went away. It wasn't until 1935 that Hitler has to clarify that, in fact, he's joking about this being a socialist movement. So they're very skeptical of Hitler, but when he becomes chancellor and it becomes clear which way things are tipping, there is this kind of moment in early 1933 when many of these big firms basically strike a deal with the regime. That is to say that they will give their support, their total support to the regime in exchange for being assigned a privileged place in the Third Reich economy and generating rents from that. I think it's interesting to compare different institutions of German society as to how easy or difficult they were to sort of appropriate to the regime. We often think about Hitler coming to power in 1933, that's clearly true. But it takes Hitler, it takes the party a good year and a half to sort of fully consolidate political control. So government, he's just chancellor first. He's still sharing power with Hindenburg, and it's still quite unclear as to what the long-term political outlook is. The military, obviously, the military becomes a source of strength for the regime. But if you sort of read histories of the Third Reich and look at how many times we came within a hair's breadth of a coup or an assassination, and if the ball just bounces a little bit differently on a particular day, the military might have taken him out. And this is true from like 36 all the way till 44, 45. He had a grip on the military, but it was always a precarious grip. The church, again, he certainly takes control of the church, both Catholic and Protestant in Germany, but there still are pockets of resistance within the church. The one place that I think you really see almost total plenary control and total alignment with the regime after the Faustian bargain is struck is in these monopoly firms. And because they're not ideologically aligned with the regime necessarily, but they're on all fours with serving the regime's functions in order to have this privileged position and generate monopoly profits. The second mechanism, which is related to the first one, is organizational structure. So, Hitler never had any economic idea in his head at all. I mean, he had political ideas, he had military ideas, mostly bad ones, but he really did not have a strong economic intuition at all, nor did the Nazi Party as the party ever really have a bureaucratic structure that would allow it to run the economy as part of the totalitarian regime. And so what you see these firms like Farben and Siemens and Krupp doing is sort of lending the regime their bureaucratic structure. And many, they have 200,000 employees, and they have a reach across the country. They can spread propaganda. They can ensure allegiance to the party's message across all their employees. They can actually run key sectors of the economy. So people like the head of IG Farben is named the national deputy for chemicals. So he's actually given a political title, even though he continues to be working within the firm. So that organizational structure that these enormous business enterprises could offer was really critical to the Nazi war machine. Cartels as devices of regime control. So as of 1933, the Nazis make participation in cartels mandatory in most industries, but it's really easier to use these cartel regimes or cartel organizations as regimes of political control because they're already so pervasive and in place and already have such consolidation of economic control through these cartel structures. So there's quite a bit of evidence that even as to sort of smaller business organizations, the fact that the market was so heavily cartelized made it much easier for the party to use cartels as mechanisms of political control as well. My fourth mechanism is national champions in foreign policy. And so again, lots of these big German monopolies in the 1930s enter into market division agreements with companies in the United States or the UK. And the way these often work is to give the German monopoly control over a particular area of the world and often over a particular chemical or military input. So the Buna rubber story with Farben is really interesting. So the War Department after Pearl Harbor is really very angry to learn that as the supplies of rubber from the Pacific become increasingly unavailable because of the war, that Standard Oil, although it has these patents involving synthetic rubber, has no idea at all how to make synthetic rubber. And that really is attributable to the fact that Standard Oil had signed over to Farben the right to all R&D around Buna rubber, and then Farben, of course, drags its heels for years in sharing that information with Standard Oil. So there's a way in which this monopoly structure allows the German regime to obtain economic control over key military assets as well. And the last point I want to make just concerns, this may be a tangential point, but I think it's really interesting to sort of think about, is the loss of intra-firm democracy. So a company like Farben, which after 1925 is a huge conglomerate chemical company with thousands upon thousands of shareholders and managers, Byzantine reporting structures, lots of transparency internally. in the regime period, in the Third Reich period, undergoes this transformation into a company that's run by, one or two managers who, and basically the firm begins replicating the political structure of the country as a whole. And I think there are these interesting feedback loops between the sort of democracy in markets, democracy in the country, and democracy within the firm. And so the same thing happens with the Krupp firm, for example. Ultimately, this is a family-owned business, so it's already very consolidated in terms of control, but there were external shareholders who had some degree of control as well. And ultimately, Krupp goes to Hitler and says, look, in order to do your bidding, I need you to give total control over the company to me and to my heirs. And Hitler signs a law making that happen. And so again, you sort of see the way in which firm organization and dispersion or consolidation of power within firms has mirroring effects in markets more generally and in the democratic structure more generally. So that's the end of my presentation. I look forward now to hearing Liza's presentation.
Thank you very much. Liza, ball is on your court.
Thank you very much. And of course, thank you very much to the Stigler Center for inviting me here today. And I'm going to talk about ordoliberalism, which is something I had written a book about some years ago now. And I also wrote my PhD thesis on the subject. But the reason, I guess, why it's interesting to talk about that today is because some of my recent work has been on big tech and the digital economy and the parallels between the extreme concentrations we see in the markets today and the period that Daniel, he just spoke about. So firstly, I will run through what ordoliberalism is and what kind of society ordoliberals believed in and their view on antitrust law. So why has ordoliberalism suddenly become kind of the talk of town again? That's probably because with the digital evolution, we see huge market concentrations in certain markets, and with the rise of the platform economy, we see an increase in private economic power. But not only that, we also see private economic power being intertwined with political power, which has led to a regulatory stagnation within the digital economy. Just think about the Facebook saga and what went on in the Senate hearings a couple of years ago with Mark Zuckerberg, to give you an example of that. And the trends we see in the economy now is trends that we haven't seen since around the period of the Second World War and the period Daniel, he just spoke about. So then the question becomes whether we need to look at antitrust from an ordoliberal view again, which is a much broader view than economic efficiency, which has dictated antitrust law for decades now. So therefore, that's why I'm going to take you back to ordoliberalism and what that was about. So the ideas of ordoliberalism took shape in response to the economic, political, and social crisis, starting with the fall of the Weimar Republic in 1933 and the rise of Nazi Germany. And of course, one of the greatest European calamities resulting from the Nazi regime was the misuse of the powerful iron and steel industry by turning private economic power into political power. And we saw well-run cartels and monopolies, which of course resulted in powerful economic concentrations in conjunction with great accumulation of political power, which of course led to the abandonment of democratic principles. So ordoliberalism decided that they disliked both totalitarianism as well as socialism, because they considered both these ideologies were contrary to the principles of private property, free market economy, and paid very little attention to the rule of law. So they basically rejected both the notion of totalitarianism and socialism, and they developed the idea of the social market economy. And the idea of the social market economy is underpinning the very treaties of the Europe, which came into force in 1958 when the European Union was not the Union at the time, but what is today the European Union was established. And the social market economy is still the fundamental underpinning of what Europe is today. So in order to avoid the repetition of history and to prevent private economic power turning into political power, it was imperative for ordoliberals to establish the appropriate economic order protected by the appropriate legal framework. So they dedicated that to achieving an economic order which was able to control both private economic power and political power in order to ensure a humane society which guaranteed individual economic freedom and price stability. And price stability was seen for them as essential for society where long-term contracts would act as a cement for civil society, while the economic order was seen as necessary both to prevent the accumulation of private economic power and sustain economic development. So the higher the level of competition in the economy, the more effectively the system functioned according to ordoliberals. So the social market economy became the name for the economic order underlying the transactional economy. And the individual characteristics of the transactional economy were private property, the protection of economic freedom, and low barriers to entry into markets. So, and it's not just some fluffy theoretical idea, because the ordoliberal framework actually became the economic system that were created in what was then West Germany, which is of course now Germany. But back in the days, after the Second World War, that was the system that West Germany implemented. So it's very important to understand that ordoliberals saw individual economic freedom and competition as sources of political freedom. They believed that the institutional framework that constituted a well-functioning market could not be expected to rise naturally, but rather was a matter of constitutional choice. So the economic constitution emphasized the need for antitrust laws to control the economic power of private firms and prohibit the conduct by firms with power, which would otherwise interfere with the process of competition. So they were committed to economic rationality and a system of undistorted competition by implementing and protected by a legal framework. And the idea of the legal framework was that should regulate and limit the emergence of private economic power by prohibiting cartels, the growth of economic power and contracts, and to avoid that you have unjust power in certain sectors. So they don't mind so much that companies are growing if it's based on efficiency, but if it's based on increasing barriers to entry or barriers to expansion, then they were not happy with that. So they basically saw private economic power as a threat, could be a threat to the competitive process. So the primary function of antitrust laws was to eliminate that power in order to protect the process of competition. And it has been, some parallels has been drawn to whether ordoliberals, they're protecting competitors rather than competition. But that's not the case, because first of all, in order to have a competitive process, you need competitors in the market. And the competitors we want in the market are efficient competitors. So obviously they don't believe in protecting inefficient competitors, but they're believing in protecting efficient competitors because that leads to a process of competition. So effectively every kind of power, whether political or economic power, must be associated with checks and balances. So they argue strongly for representative democracy, and of course against the power of firms that can hinder the performance of efficient rivals. So basically, finally, we can break down ordoliberalism in terms of competition policy into four main points, which is First, the primary goal of competition policy is to protect individual economic freedom. And second, that the state retains a very strong role in protecting the basic parameters of the system of competition, but with strict limits on direct intervention. So although they believe that the state should intervene to cure market failures, they also had a limit to that, because as much as they disliked private economic power, they also very much disliked big government. And third, competition policy should be shaped by the rule of law rather than by ad hoc political decision making. And fourth and finally, competition policy and antitrust law should be embedded in the economic order of a free and open society. So when we think about that was their view on society, and then think about where we are today in the digital economy with we see huge concentrations in certain markets, one can then wonder whether we should look at competition and antitrust law from an ordoliberal point of view again, rather than the narrow view of pure economic efficiency. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liza. And I think that we're going to start the discussion, but if you have a pressing question, of course, please feel free to ask, and something that's connected here. We already have some questions, and we'll move to a explicit Q&A afterwards, but I'm happy to add them in the debate. So when we're talking here about industrial cartels in Germany, are we really talking about firms with market power, or we're just talking about very large firms? So I think a lot of the mechanisms that Daniel described and some of the concerns that Liza described afterwards, or the liberal concerns, are we discussing like firms with extra profits and they're both huge and very profitable, or are we just discussing very, very large conglomerates? What was the main concern?
So I think it's both in a way. And in my paper, I sort of talk about the distinction between large scale and market power. To an economist, those are very different things, right? So a good example is General Motors, which is an enormous organization in the United States today, and at one time probably had market power, but today has almost no market power because the automobile sector is so competitive. So a firm can be very large and not have market power. A firm can be relatively small in size and in a niche geographically or a product niche can have lots of market power. So it's hard to disentangle, I think, sort of pure size from market power. I do think, though, that the story of Germany in the Weimar period and the Nazi period is one where significant increases in market power as sort of a distinct type of effect that antitrust law is concerned about facilitated the rise of Nazism. I think the cartel example is a good one. So as I said before, many firms that participate in those cartels were not large firms. Some of these cartels had hundreds or thousands of firms in them. Yet the cartel structure, which was an anti-competitive structure, allowed for the appropriation, very easy appropriation of entire industrial segments by the regime very quickly. If you sort of imagine the counterexample where you had a very uncoordinated market except by the invisible hand, there wouldn't have been any sort of organizational structure nor tradition of kind of coordination by the firms that would have allowed the regime to take hold of that sector so quickly. There also, though, were industrial sectors where it went from cartelization to sort of pure monopoly. I think the IG Farben story is a good one where it starts out as cartelized, but once you've merged all the major chemical firms into a single integrated company, I mean, you don't need a cartel anymore, right? You have a single firm that runs, most of these industrial segments with 100% or 90% market share. So I think, market power played a distinctive role both insofar as we're talking about cartel organizations and also about sort of anti-competitive mergers or monopolization tactics that resulted in a single firm dominating the entire industry.
Yeah, I would agree with Daniel on that. I don't think size in and of itself matters so much. Ordoliberals, for ordoliberals, what matters was barrier to entry. And I think we can all agree that that's still a very big factor in antitrust today is whether there is high or low barriers to entry into the market. Because if you just hold a large position, but due to innovation, you can lose that position very quickly. then that's really what's important. Not so much the market share of today or the sheer size of the company, but rather whether you can maintain that and what you actually do with that power, because you can be big and you can do good for society. The question is, are you using that power and that bigness to actually artificially prevent equally efficient competitors to leave the market, or are you actually using that to serve society for something good?
Okay, no, I think that's interesting. We can build on that for the next question, because it's a bit hard for the state to judge what is to do good for society or not. I think that is a big power. And I think a bit of what Daniel describes in his paper that's interesting is to compare IG Farben with Siemens, as IG Farben as a company that's very early aligned with the regime, and Siemens as a company who disliked the regime and never liked the regime, but nonetheless was very quickly co-opted by the regime itself. So I was wondering if you could dig a bit deeper on whether these mechanisms that enable the connection of market power with political power, whether it makes a difference for them on the type of alignment, and if not, why doesn't it make a difference on the firm's initial political view into this process and how it develops?
Lisa, you want to go first?
Oh, go ahead, Daniel.
Okay, so I think there were many paths that these firms took to ultimately collaborating with the regime, and some came more willingly than others, and some were kicking and screaming. I mean, Krupp is a good example of a very old family-owned business. There's some work suggesting that family-owned businesses were much slower to embrace the regime than widely held businesses, because the widely held businesses just really cared about maximizing profits, and that was the Faustian bargain. You maximize profits by going along with the guy who is willing to trade you profits for support. Whereas the family-owned businesses sort of maybe had a bit more of a longitudinal view and a bit more sort of pride of principle. But in the end, like whether you're Krupp and family-owned or IG Farben and widely held, the influence or the temptation to make that exchange was overwhelming. So eventually, and that doesn't take a long time. We're talking about like who goes more quickly in 1933. But by even 1933, all the big firms basically had come over to the side of the regime. But again, I think it's so important to understand we're talking here about structure, not about any individual's agency or decision making. It's interesting to think about in the United States in the early 20th century, the socialist movement. Yeah, we had a socialist movement in the United States at one time, and the socialists were very, very skeptical of antitrust law. They were skeptical of antitrust law, and this was something they borrowed from Marx, because they saw the trusts that were forming these enormous agglomerations of capital and control over entire industries in the trust form as being really important stepping stones to government ownership of industry. Now, like the industrial captains who were forming the trust, that was not their objective at all. They weren't trying to move towards socialism. They wanted control and profits. But to the socialists, they sort of saw the same structure as being one that was conducive to their political aims. And so I think, again, lots of the historical debate about Germany and the role of big business has gotten sort of tied up in this question, which is maybe interesting, but not the one I'm interested in as an antitrust person, about ability or the volition or the intention of big business. As an antitrust person, I'm much more interested in incentives and structures, and I think what we see in Germany is across the board, the highly concentrated economic power just makes it easier for a political figure who wants to obtain highly concentrated political power to appropriate that highly concentrated economic power and then translate that into highly concentrated political power.
Yeah, I mean, to take a recent example of how we see political and economic power being intertwined today, we don't have to go further away than Facebook and the complete political stagnations to do anything about Facebook, because of course it serves the purpose of politicians, because politicians can go directly out to voters, they can circumvent electoral law, and they can circumvent the BBC or other news stations which actually have a duty to balance, and therefore they can go directly out to voters, and in that way they completely control the narrative by going directly through the platform. And in return, of course, they're not going to start regulating, are they?
Okay, and we have a couple of questions here. So there's a question from Luigi has a pressing question. He's asking whether if you can trace a difference between monopolies helping Hitler consolidate power versus monopolies helping Hitler rise to power. Can you make that distinction, or is more a matter of consolidation and the structure consolidation than like enabling him to rise? So what would you say? And Liza, do you think that did the order liberals have a view on this as well, or do you think or not?
Yeah, it's interesting to ask, like, when does Hitler rise to power? When does he consolidate power? So, like, you know, the Nazi Party is formed in 1919. Hitler spends a good bit of those early years in prison. You know, and so I mean, I think about it as a sort of 1933 as the sort of critical year, obviously. So before 1933, the Nazi Party is not in power in Germany in a political sense. He doesn't hold the chancellorship. And in 1933 forward, really to say mid-34, he's consolidating power. The way I think about it is that prior to January 1933, very few big German businesses certainly weren't funding him. If you look at the records of who was funding the Nazi Party, there were a few exceptions, but largely speaking, it was not primarily coming from big business. They weren't politically supporting him, so you know they were not ideologically aligned. They were much more with Hindenburg. You know, that I think that changes dramatically in about February and March 1933, and that's really the watershed period when they made the calculus that this guy is coming to power, and there's an opportunity here, and he wants to rearm for the war, right? He wants to rearm, he wants to overthrow the Treaty of Versailles. He's doing a bunch of things that will be good for us economically, and if we can make sure he doesn't actually mean socialism as in National Socialism, we have an opportunity to do well by this. And so this calculation is made, the Faustian bargain is cut. And so, but now, I think from my perspective, though, it's not fait accompli yet in terms of Hitler having power. I mean, he does not get control of the army until June 1934, when Hindenburg dies. It takes him, you know, we think about like Hitler coming to power is a binary thing, but there's a period when his power for a couple of years remains quite unstable. I mean, even after he occupies the Rhineland, you know, the military comes really close to saying enough is enough. This guy's gonna take us to war. We want rearmament. We don't want war, but we're not prepared for it yet. So I just don't. I think that big businesses' support coming in early 1933 allows him to consolidate power that he was already grasping at before that.
Yeah, I mean, I have only one small comment to add, which is, of course, with the consolidation of power, it's quite clear that Hitler, he can control the industry much better. It's easier to control industry where the market is concentrated rather than fragmented.
Okay, and then I think moving a little bit forward, then did we manage to break this link afterwards? Like I think you talk a lot about the liberals. There's a question here whether Liza, for example, you can provide a good decision, like decisions from the European courts or something like this early on. They were based on real concerns on power considerations, not efficiency considerations. And then, and I think it goes a bit to Daniel as well to understand, like you had a huge movement for antitrust push in the US with the Seller-Kefauver Act, and then this wanes a little bit. So do you think that afterwards, if there was a diagnosis on both sides that this was an issue, like did we manage to break this link afterwards using antitrust or not?
Well, I see a bit of a fluctuation in the case law that has come out from the courts in Europe. So there's always been a debate about, you know, are they relying on efficiency? Are they relying on order liberalism and economic freedom? And what is it? And I'm sure that people can read into the case law whatever they desire and whatever they feel like serves their purpose. So obviously that's a debate, but it's quite clear that European case law is all about the integration of the single market, because unlike the United States, Europe consists of 28, soon to be 27 member states. So therefore, European case law and competition law in particular is all about the market integration objective. but with that also comes, you know, the idea about efficiency as well as economic freedom. So you can see you can see different different interpretations, and it hasn't been all the same since the 60s up until today. So and as well in the U.S. with the Chicago School in the 70s.
You know, I think what happens in the U.S. is that decartelization team that goes to Germany and is supposed to be working for the military government there to decartelize the German economy and meets the failure I mentioned before, because they're basically overruled politically by the military, the U.S. military government. But they do find an audience back in the United States. And so in 1950, when Senators Seller and Kefauver are describing the merger reform that they want, they very heavily rely on the work generated by that decartelization unit in explaining why it's not a good idea in the United States to allow this rising tide of economic concentration. They say this will lead us either in the direction of fascism or towards Stalinism. And so in 1950, there's very much a sense that domestically back in the United States, this learning from Europe needs to inform antitrust policy going forward. Now, as Liza mentions, you know, that has a shelf life of a couple of decades, and I think the Chicago School of the 70s, but there are many other factors as well. It's the rise of the consumerist movement, which is both on the right and, like Ralph Nader, on the left. The Hart-Scott-Rodino Act of 1976, which sort of takes merger review out of the courts and into the antitrust agencies. The professionalization of economics in the agencies, the demise of the structuralist Harvard School in the academy. I mean, there are many, many different factors that sort of translate into this sort of dramatic shift on merger policy and antitrust law in general after the 1970s. But there certainly is a period in American history where the lessons, whether rightly or wrongly, the lessons from Germany and to some extent Japan on economics informing politics have resonance in the political classes.
Okay, I think we have a very good question from Michael Cates here, and he's asking, can we say something about the difference between big business and the Nazis versus big business and fascism in Italy, or Vichy government in France, or the Peace Party in the UK? Have you come across, did the Ordo Liberals, Liza, do you think, was their diagnostics mostly restricted to Germany, and then they tried to impose this view on all of the rest of Europe? Or did they see this as a problem for the whole continent? I don't know, Daniel, if you come across in your research something about these comparisons that we can make, anything like that, I think would be very interesting.
It's quite clear that it started in Germany and it was implemented in West Germany first. So it was clearly a German thing. But the fact is that the European treaties heavily rely on a social market economy, which was what Ordo Liberals had advocated for. That means it's the underpinning of what Europe is today. And then, of course, the pendulum is swimming now, because, again, very much like when Hitler came to power, where small businesses was unhappy because they didn't feel they participated in the economy, I think this is where we are today again. I think there is a number of small, medium-sized enterprises that feels excluded from the economy or globalization today, and I think that's why we see the pendulum swinging towards the things you just mentioned, what's happening in Italy, what's happening around Europe.
Yeah, so I know that my co-author Alexander Luis Fisas is on the program as well today, and he and I are actually looking right now at the question of extending this research to Franco's Spain, along with a Portuguese co-author looking at Salazar's Portugal and Estadio Novo. And really the question is, can you generalize the story? Can you say that whether it's fascism in particular, or Pinochet's Chile, or imperial Japan, like any time you get extreme concentration of economic power sort of lurking in the background, or extreme concentration of political power lurking in the background, there must be also extreme concentration of economic power, right? so what do you do with the Soviet Union? I mean, the story just does not seem to fit very well, with the rise of the Soviet Union. So I want to be careful about what I can say. As to Germany, I find a story that seems to hold water fairly tightly. I think we're going to find in sort of non-war economies in Portugal and Spain that are fascist or quasi-fascist, I think we're going to find something similar playing out. But I'm still early on in my own work here, and I very interested. And I haven't looked at Mussolini's Italy much yet at all. So if people know of interesting work on these topics, I'd be very interested to hear from you.
Okay, and then so I think Liza was talking a little bit more about the present. So can we have any traces between what's going on right now? So we know right now that there's like data showing like there's a trust in democracy is eroding, especially along millennials, like my generation, unfortunately. There's a drop in the labor share. We know that there's rising inequality and increased markups. We have a major crisis. Now, this was all before COVID-19 now did a rampage with small business, no? And then, and we know that, of course, was not only one factor. So Professor Joachim Wolff is actually in the audience here and has an excellent paper we're actually discussing before about how like bank failures also led to the rise of popularity of Hitler, and especially into like countries that had the anti-Semitism movements. So can you trace any parallels between what happened in the 30s and what's happening right now? If yes, what are these parallels? If not, what are red lines? So at what point we reach red lines? What should we be looking for that's very, very dangerous?
I mean, every time we have a crisis, whether that is the First World War, the Second World War, whether it's a financial crisis, whether it's a pandemic, and wherever we are in the world with these things, you see a relaxation of antitrust laws. So fast forward to COVID-19, then you see in a pandemic now that you have a relaxation of antitrust laws, and you see firms failing, M&A activity has come to a standstill. Many small, medium-sized businesses are going out of the market due to what's happening, and you see big companies being able to snap up these smaller companies, and therefore we are probably going to see in the aftermath of this pandemic that there is an increase in concentration again. So it's what tend to happen during these crises is that there is a relaxation of antitrust law, and the politicians will need to tell us what to do about that, but it's a worrying trend.
So I agree with Liza that historically, and I've written about this a little bit, that there's been a relaxation of antitrust law during wars and dramatic economic crises. I went looking for evidence that during the Spanish influenza epidemic of 1918 that there was a relaxation of antitrust, but I couldn't find that, mostly because it's so tied up with the end of World War I when there was a tolling of antitrust cases. But to the broader point, like, have we crossed a red line, or are we close to crossing a red line so that our economies in Europe or the United States are looking like the Weimar economy, and we should be really worried that Hitler's around the corner again? Maybe I'm naive, but I don't think we're nearly there yet. I mean, I certainly think that there are market sectors, maybe big tech, where we should be worried about concentration of economic power. But economy-wide, I know this is contested right now, but economy-wide, I don't think we're there. I mean, I see many sectors that are, I mean, the one sector I follow, which is automobiles, which is much more competitive, dynamic, many more participants today than there were 20 or 30 years ago. I think about computers, I think about smartphones, I think about lots of market sectors which seem to me to be actually quite healthy and robust. So I'm just personally not ready to say that, like, I have the same pervasive concern about economic concentration that I think clearly characterized the Weimar government in 1930s. That said, I also do think that my own takeaway here is that we should take this very seriously. That is a good reason, is an important reason to have a robust competition law regime that is democracy facing. Not that it's not that it's political, not that we're making political decisions necessarily on enforcement, that's dangerous, but that as we think about the reasons we have antitrust law, even if it's economically focused, that protecting democracy can be one of those.
Okay, just to follow up on this, but are we concerned about widespread market concentration, or are we concerned mostly about concentration in given sectors? Like, can you make a parallel between Krupp and Boeing right now? And we have very specific important sectors that are consolidating, right? So we have financial sector is consolidating, where the airline sector is consolidating, pharmaceuticals are consolidating, tech, of course, consolidated. A lot of arms suppliers are consolidated. So are we more concerned about economy-wide consolidation? Are you concerned about key sectors consolidation? Like the mechanisms that we discussed before, are they more connected to a specific company or to the whole economy?
I would say it's specific sectors of the economy. It would be difficult for me to say it's the entire economy. So for me, it's very much specific sectors as the ones you have just mentioned yourself. And Daniel, he also mentioned that there are many markets that are hugely competitive and hugely fragmented. So it's definitely a sector-specific thing. Having said that, the digital economy is underlying almost every sector nowadays. So one just have to be a little bit alert to the digital evolution and how that moves into a majority of sectors today.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Filippo, and I thought about it some, and I think it's hard for me to answer it categorically, partly because in historical context, you know, Hitler coming to power is basically synonymous with German rearmament. I mean, you know, the one tenet that Hitler convinced the German people of in 1933 was that Versailles had to go, and Germany could no longer be a second-class citizen in Europe. Germany had to have the right to be autonomous and to rearm. And so the industries that were, in some sense, the monopoly industries that are key to Hitler's political project are its chemicals, it's steel, it's armaments, it's coal, it's things that are tied into rearmament, right? And I don't like. The United States does not need to rearm, right? That's not our problem. So it's hard for me to say as a generality that it's the entire economy or any particular sector. I think that's contingent upon the kind of the way in which a political leadership could try to use industrial concentration to rise to power. Okay.
We have a lot of questions. I've been trying to mend them in, but we have a lot of questions about the Nazi period. So Professor Hockenbach is asking again if he says a bit surprised by the Mente's discussion here. He's saying the IG Farben was already a monopoly in the 20s when Germany was still a democracy. And he said the armament production remained competitive until almost the end of the Second World War there. So how could we test whether market concentration really led to Hitler? And he's saying also, for example, that the UK had an imperial chemical industry that was just like a monopoly, like IG Farben, and this didn't become a monopoly. So he's trying to understand like where does such a certainty comes from?
Well, it's not certainty, but so IG Farben was the fourth largest firm in the world. The top three were American, right? So this is one of the interesting questions, which is like if this causation story is wrong, then like the American war economy, which I know more about than the UK war economy, but the American war economy was extremely concentrated. In fact, this was part of what President Roosevelt does, is he allows concentration to happen after Pearl Harbor. So this is part of the reason, though, that I am avoiding these kinds of root cause claims, which I think we've sort of heard from Marxist historians that sort of this is the root cause of Hitler's rise to power. That just doesn't make any sense to me. A more modest claim is facilitation, which is it easier for Hitler to take plenary political control at the level he does, given the extremely concentrated economic power in Germany? And there I think there's lots of evidence that it does, and that's where the mechanisms comes in.
Liza, do you think that the liberals were very sure of this connection based on like their diagnosis of the time? Or what have you seen already? Have you seen something like this?
Sorry, I didn't quite get your question.
No, so the liberals were very sure of this connection, right? So they tried to promote an entire reform, and they were studying, like they were the Freiburg school. They were really studying this movement. So do you think that they really saw this as like also as an enabling factor, a facilitating factor, or they saw more like as a causing factor?
Well, that's difficult to say. There's no clear answer to that really. So I don't think it was something necessarily they thought about much.
And there's a question here about Austria. If we find similar patterns about Austria and concerns was also about Austria, in particular, but given the Anschluss, I don't know if I pronounced this correctly, and if you have similar efforts in decartelization in Austria rather than in Germany.
I have not looked at Austria independently from Germany, so I'm afraid I can't answer that question.
No, okay. And I'll ask, I think, a final question because we need to end. There's someone is asking whether there was a way to direct human capital. So how did the Nazis direct human capital to its highest value uses, and whether if these wouldn't like somehow undermine the war efforts? So whether the cartels were able to bid for general human capital, or people were just channeled through specific firms, or was just like an outright conscription system that forced people to kind of like be aligned with the regime?
Well, so it's a complex question. I mean, one of the obvious answers is that one of the reasons that the Germans lost the war is because they made, from just a pure managerial perspective, the awful decision to exclude Jews from the economy. And so IG Farben had a number of Jewish managers who were in very important positions, and the firm, for as long as it could, actually protected them, not through altruism, not through humanity, because they were really important to the firm. And eventually, of course, they had to go, right? And obviously you have all the stories about scientists who fled Germany and go off and work on the atomic bomb in the United States. So I mean, I think, like, again, to make the obvious point, but the Nazi ideology was self-destructive. It was inefficient in that sense, in an economic sense. It actually excluded from really important scientific, managerial functions like wide populations that were indispensable to those things. More broadly, I mean, Hitler, he didn't have, as I said before, he didn't have economic ideas. He did have political ideas, including about, like, against labor mobility. So Hitler, like some of the early economic decrees Hitler makes are to sort of lock people into the station they're in at the time. So you can't, so labor mobility really ceases. And I do think that firms like IG Farben, which I've studied in some detail, become much more centralized in terms of their control. And because of that, they kind of lose, I mean, maybe they gain a certain efficiency of managerial, sort of short-term efficiency of managerial dictation, but they kind of lose the internal dynamics of large organizations that have to know how to allow expression of dissent and competing internal views in order to be successful organizations.
Okay, and then to conclude, a question for both of you. So do we need antitrust reform? What does this lesson teach us for more immediate concerns, like how is antitrust moving forward? Do we need new reforms or not? And if yes, what should it look like?
Wow, that was a very small question to finish. I mean, that's obviously an excellent question, and a question that's being debated globally at the moment. And I think that we have seen a number of reports around the world, one from the Stigler, where you're from, of course, the Stigler report, and we have seen the ACCC from Australia, we have the Furman report from the UK, and we have the report that was commissioned by the European Commission. And so we have quite a lot of reports going around at the moment, and the general trend is that something needs to be done. What that something is obviously debatable. So I will preserve judgment on that one.
Yeah, I recently submitted some comments to the House Judiciary Committee about antitrust reform. My own view of the United States is we do not need statutory reform, at least substantive statutory reform. In terms of the way the agencies and the courts think about mergers, I do think that we have some more learning to do, and maybe some kind of a change in some presumptions, particularly around big tech. So, but statutory reforms, I don't think would be productive.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for I think it was a very engaging talk. And stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.